My name is Corinne, and I'm 50 years old. The first warning was my key refusing to turn. The second was a stranger answering the door to my $380,000 apartment. But the part that still makes my chest burn? Realizing my own parents forged my name, sold my home behind my back, and then had the nerve to ask me to pay their rent. I didn't just discover a betrayal that day. I uncovered a secret they never meant for me to find. For most of my adult life, I've worked as an archivist and historical researcher, one of those quiet, meticulous careers that most people don't understand until they need someone who can track a 19th century property record or decipher handwriting in a faded family ledger. I've always found peace in the details, in preserving other people's histories, even when my own life felt more like a stack of unresolved footnotes. I live alone, by choice more than circumstance, and my small 2-bedroom apartment had always been my sanctuary, the one place where I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. So when I left for a 6-month research fellowship abroad, it felt safe to lock up, leave a few plants with a neighbor, and hand my parents a spare key for emergencies only. My relationship with my parents has always been layered. Not broken, not warm, but tangled in a way that only decades of subtle guilt, unspoken expectations, and mismatched personalities can create. They're aging, stubborn, and perpetually convinced that their way of living, on impulse without planning, is simply how life should be. I've always been the opposite, structured, cautious, maybe even overly responsible. Still, despite our differences, I trusted them enough to leave them the key. They had promised not to use it unless there was a true emergency. I believed them. After 6 months overseas, filled with dusty archives, long train rides, and the quiet thrill of discovery, I was ready to come home. I missed my apartment more than anything. My own bed, my own kitchen, my carefully curated shelves of books. The moment I stepped through the lobby doors of my building, I felt the familiar comfort wash over me. Until the building manager, Mr. Ridley, spotted me from across the room and froze like he'd seen a ghost. "Corinne," he said too quickly, "you're back earlier than expected." I frowned. "I sent an email a week ago." "Yes, of course. Right. Welcome home." His words were clipped, awkward, and his eyes kept darting toward the hallway as though he needed to be anywhere but here. I brushed off the odd behavior, chalking it up to him just being his usual tightly wound self. The elevator ride up felt heavier than normal, though, like a slow climb toward something I couldn't name. When I reached my door, my suitcase wheels rattling across the familiar hallway tiles, I pulled out my key with a relieved sigh. Home. Finally. But when I slid the key into the lock, it jammed halfway. I jiggled it, twisted. The doorknob tried again. Nothing. My brow furrowed. Maybe the lock had been changed for security reasons while I was gone. That would have been strange, but not impossible. I leaned in, inspecting the keyhole, and then I heard footsteps on the other side. The door swung open, but instead of the quiet, plant-filled apartment I expected, I found myself staring at a woman I had never seen before. Behind her, a toddler squealed and ran across my living room, and a man carrying a laundry basket looked up with confusion. "Yes?" the woman asked, her expression tight with polite irritation, as though I were a door-to-door salesperson interrupting her afternoon. I'm sorry," I stammered. "This is my apartment." The man blinked. "No, ma'am. This is our apartment. We bought it 3 months ago." For a moment, my brain couldn't process the words. Bought it? Bought it. My heartbeat kicked into a frantic rhythm as I glanced past them again. My rug, my shelves, except the shelves were bare. My belongings were nowhere in sight. The space looked like their home now, not mine. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, heat rising in my chest. "I own this place. I've lived here for years. I've been abroad. My things—" The woman shook her head. "Everything was removed before we moved in. We were told the previous owner had already relocated." "I am the previous owner," I snapped, panic tightening my throat. The man sighed, as though this was some tiresome misunderstanding. "Look, the sale went through months ago. We have the paperwork. If you need details, talk to the management office, but please, we have a baby sleeping." He closed the door gently, but firmly, and I stood there, staring at the number on the door, feeling as though the ground had dropped away beneath me. My hands shook as I rushed back to the elevator, my mind racing so fast that breathing felt impossible. I practically ran across the lobby toward Mr. Ridley's office, my suitcase bumping behind me like a stubborn shadow. He looked up the moment I burst inside, guilt flashing so quickly across his face that I almost missed it. "What happened?" I demanded. "Why are strangers living in my apartment?" He hesitated, swallowed hard, and lowered his voice. "Corinne, your apartment was sold while you were abroad. My name was no longer listed as the property owner, even though I never signed anything." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stared at Mr. Ridley, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would make sense of what I'd just heard. But he only pressed his lips together and gestured for me to close the office door. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I stepped inside and sat down across from him, gripping the armrests of the chair like they were the only things holding me upright. "What do you mean my apartment was sold, Jan Hint?" I demanded. "I'm the owner. I never put it on the market. I never authorized any sale. How is that even possible?" He exhaled slowly, the way people do when they know they're about to be blamed for something they couldn't stop. "Corinne, I thought you were aware. The paperwork came through 3 months ago. The title transfer was processed by a certified agent, and all signatures were confirmed." I felt something cold wrap around my spine. Confirmed by who? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to a locked filing cabinet, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it in front of me. My name was printed on the tab. I pulled it open with trembling hands. Inside were copies of the sale documents, property transfer forms, notarized signatures, closing agreements. I scanned page after page, breath tightening with every line, and then I saw it. My signature, or rather, someone's pitiful attempt at replicating it. The letters were slanted the wrong way. My last name was spelled with an extra flourish I never used. It looked like someone had practiced it once or twice, badly, and decided it was good enough. "This is forged," I whispered. "This isn't my handwriting. I didn't sign this. I wasn't even in the country." Mr. Ridley's face flushed with discomfort. "I suspected something was off," he admitted. But the real estate agent insisted everything was legitimate. The bank approved the wire transfer, the buyers showed no red flags, and the sale, well, it went through very quickly. "Quickly how?" I snapped. He hesitated. 2 days. 2 days? My voice cracked. "A real estate sale of a $380,000 property doesn't finalize in 2 days, not legally." "I know," he said softly. "But all the documents were provided, IDs, signatures, confirmations, everything checked out, at least on the surface." My shock was slowly morphing into rage, burning, acidic rage that clawed at my ribs. My own home, my sanctuary, sold behind my back with forged signatures and a rushed clearance. And no one noticed, no one questioned it. I dug deeper into the folder, scanning each sheet faster, more frantically. There should have been records of the funds, some trace of the $380,000 sale amount. I couldn't find anything in the printed statements. Not a deposit, not a wire transfer, nothing. "Where did the money go?" I demanded. "Where's the bank documentation for the sale funds? Who received them?" "That part wasn't included," he admitted. "We don't have access to the buyer-seller financial transfers. You'd need to check your bank." I grabbed my phone, my fingers icy as I logged into my online banking. Page after page of transaction history scrolled by. Airline tickets, meal expenses, hotel receipts, the ordinary transactions of my life abroad. But no large deposits, no mysterious sums, no $380,000. Nothing. "It's not there," I said, choking on disbelief. "If someone sold my apartment, the money never reached my accounts." Mr. Ridley nodded grimly. "Then whoever did this probably redirected the funds elsewhere." A sickening possibility began crawling into my mind. Someone close enough to know I was out of the country, close enough to know about the spare key, close enough to know my signature well enough to attempt forging it. I didn't want to think it. I didn't want to follow the thread. But it pulled anyway. My hands shook as I closed the folder. "I need the name of the agent who handled the sale." He scribbled it on a sticky note. "Leo Herrick," along with a phone number. I dialed immediately. The phone rang twice before a breezy male voice answered. "Herrick Realty, this is Leo." "This is Corinne," I said sharply. I'm calling about the sale of my apartment. I need to know how it was processed and who signed the paperwork." There was a brief pause. Then, in a tone dripping with cheerful cluelessness, he said, "Oh, yes, of course. You're calling about the property your parents handled for you, right?" A cold wave rolled through me. "My parents?" I repeated. "Yes," he said easily. "Your parents handled everything on your behalf. They signed the documents and confirmed the sale." My throat went dry. "Which one of them signed?" "Oh, your mother," he said. "She's the one who handled all the paperwork." For a moment, I didn't breathe. My mother, my own mother, had signed the sale documents, and she had sold my home. The moment I confronted my parents, my mother didn't even bother pretending she was innocent. By the time I reached my car, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. My mother's name echoed in my mind over and over like a pounding drum. She had signed the paperwork. She had stood in front of a notary and pretended to be me. She had sold my home. The drive to their house felt longer than it ever had before, every traffic light stretching time into something unbearable. My stomach churned with a mix of disbelief and fury so intense it made my vision blur. I kept replaying the agent's words. "Your mother handled all the paperwork. My own mother, the same woman who used to scold me as a child for misplacing my lunchbox. The same woman who lectured me about honesty, responsibility, respect." The betrayal stung so sharply it felt like someone had carved it into my ribs. When I finally pulled into their driveway, I saw the living room curtains twitch. They had seen me coming. I slammed the car door and marched toward the front porch. Before I could knock, the door opened, and there they both were. My mother standing rigidly, my father behind her with a guilty, almost sheepish look. "What did you do?" I demanded. No greeting, no preamble. My voice came out low and shaking. My mother pressed her lips together, then lifted her chin with a defensive tilt I recognized immediately. "I suppose the agent told you." "Yes," I said. "He told me everything. You signed the sale documents, you forged my signature, you sold my apartment." For a moment, she didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. She didn't act confused or shocked. She simply sighed, as though I were the one being unreasonable, and stepped aside to let me in. I walked into the living room, noticing immediately how tense the air felt. My father closed the door behind us. His shoulders slumped. "We did sell it," my mother said, turning to face me. No apology, no remorse. Just an admission, clinical and cold. "We needed the money more than you did." The words punched the air out of my lungs. More than I did? That was my home, my savings, my only real asset. "You have a career," she snapped. "You're independent. You're doing well. We're retired, and things have been tight." She waved her hand dismissively, as though financial instability were a mild inconvenience, not something that had driven them to commit fraud. My father stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Corinne, sweetheart, you don't understand. We were trying to help the family. We thought this was the best choice. We were going to talk to you, eventually." "Eventually?" I echoed. "You sold my home months ago and never said a word. You let strangers move into it. You let them toss out my belongings. You stole from me." "We didn't steal," my mother snapped, her voice rising. "We simply used what was available. Families support each other. You weren't around. You were off on some trip, studying old papers or whatever it is you do, while we were here struggling." My father nodded quickly, trying to soften her edges. "We found buyers through friends, good people. They needed a place, and the offer was generous." Of course. That's how they'd done it. I could see it clearly now. One of their acquaintances had mentioned a cousin looking for property, or someone from their social circles had wanted to invest. A casual conversation, a selfish impulse, and suddenly my home, the place I had worked years to afford, was nothing more than an opportunity. "So you sold my apartment to someone you knew," I said slowly. "Because you thought I wouldn't notice." My mother crossed her arms. "You're 50 years old, Corinne. You're financially stable. You have a good job. We assumed you could recover more easily than we could." I stared at her, stunned. "That doesn't justify forging my signature. That doesn't justify wiping out my savings. That doesn't justify—" "Oh, please," she interrupted. "You've always been so dramatic. We raised you. We supported you. And yet when we needed help, you weren't there. You never offered to contribute. Not once have you." "Contribute?" I cut in sharply. "Do you hear yourself? You could have asked. You chose theft. You chose lies." Silence settled between us like heavy dust. I took a deep breath because there was one final question, the one that hollowed out my chest to even consider. What happened to the $380,000? My parents exchanged a glance, quick, nervous, telling. My father shifted from foot to foot. My mother looked away, her jaw tightening. Where is the money? I asked again, more firmly. It took nearly a full minute before my mother finally spoke. It's gone, she whispered. I stared at them, waiting for more, for an explanation, for remorse, for anything. But all they gave me was silence. They didn't lose the money. They spent it. For a few seconds, I could only stare at them, blinking, as though my mind needed extra time to process what I had just heard. Gone. The word felt sharp, metallic, slicing through every remaining thread of trust I'd held on to. Gone didn't mean misplaced. Gone didn't mean invested. Gone meant spent, deliberately, carelessly, without hesitation. How? I whispered, forcing my voice to stay steady. Do you spend $380,000 in 3 months? My father rubbed his forehead as though I were giving him a headache. Corinne. Sweetheart. Things came up. Things, I repeated flatly. My pulse thudded beneath my skin. What things? My mother finally sank onto the couch with a dramatic sigh, crossing one leg over the other. We were under a lot of stress. You don't understand how difficult things have been for us. Explain it, I demanded. All of it, every cent. She looked at my father, and for a moment I saw uncertainty flicker between them. But then, as though deciding that honesty, however ugly, was easier than pretending any longer, they began to talk. It came out in fragments at first. A new car, a much-needed upgrade, as my father phrased it, rolling his eyes as though this were obvious. They had chosen a luxury model. Nothing extravagant, he insisted, but certainly not modest either. My mother mentioned cosmetic procedures with a casual shrug, touching the corner of her tightened jawline as though the result justified the expense. Just a little refresh, she said. After everything we've dealt with, we deserve something nice. My breath caught. You spent my money on plastic surgery? Don't say it like that, she snapped defensively. Everyone does it now. My father cleared his throat. We also handled some debts. Mine. He didn't meet my eyes. There were a few gambling issues, small ones, but the interest grew. Gambling issues? My voice rose before I could control it. You gambled with my home? It wasn't like that, he insisted. It started with good luck, then it turned. I just needed to get things back on track. My mother waved her hand as though this were a mundane detail. And we loaned a bit here and there to friends who needed help. How much is a bit? I demanded. A few thousand, she muttered. My father winced. More like tens of thousands. I felt physically ill. You gave away my money. It wasn't giving away, my mother snapped. It was helping people we care about. And the rest? I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. My father shifted uncomfortably. We made a couple of investments. They sounded promising. But then the market dipped and you lost it, I finished. He nodded miserably. I pressed a trembling hand to my forehead. This wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't mismanagement. It was reckless, entitled, utterly irresponsible spending. A spree fueled by impulse and denial. What horrified me even more than the financial ruin was the complete absence of remorse on their faces. You two destroyed my life savings, I said quietly. You destroyed my home, and you're sitting here acting like you bought a few extra groceries. My father's expression hardened. We've sacrificed everything for you over the years. We deserved a break, Corinne. For once we did something for ourselves. For yourselves? I repeated. You didn't earn that money. My mother's eyes narrowed. And maybe if you had been around, instead of gallivanting overseas, you would have seen how much we were struggling. You left us. I left for work, I said sharply. A career I built on my own. A career that paid for that apartment. You're always so self-righteous, she muttered. Anger and heartbreak churned together inside me until I felt hollow. These were my parents. Two people I had always tried, desperately, to understand, to support, to maintain any shred of closeness with. And this was what they thought of me. a resource, a backup plan, a bank account they felt entitled to drain. "I can't believe you did this," I whispered. My mother lifted her chin. "We thought you'd be upset, yes, but we assumed you'd understand eventually. It's not like we spent it on nonsense." I gave a short, humorless laugh. A luxury car, cosmetic procedures, gambling, and loans to friends aren't nonsense. She rolled her eyes. "You've always been judgmental." I no longer trusted their version of events, so I needed facts. Cold, undeniable facts. "Give me your bank statements," I said. My father stiffened. "What for?" "To see exactly where the money went." "We already told you," my mother said. "Not enough." After a long, tense silence, my father finally retrieved a thick stack of printed statements from a drawer. My mother watched with a sour expression as he handed them to me. I sat down at their dining table and started reading. Line after line of transactions blurred into a whirlwind of numbers and disbelief. Boutique purchases, spa packages, resort stays, lavish dinners, cash withdrawals, questionable business ventures, subscription boxes, random transfers, and then I saw something even worse. Something they hadn't mentioned at all, and it made my blood run cold. My parents were hiding more than financial recklessness. They were hiding desperation. For a long moment, I just stared at the bank statements, feeling my pulse hammer against my ribs. The transactions weren't just careless. They were frantic, erratic. Hundreds of small charges clustered together in patterns of panic spending. Cash withdrawals taken almost daily. Payments to loan companies I didn't recognize. Missed payments, overdraft fees, late fees. It was a financial avalanche, each page worse than the last. And suddenly the truth hit me like a punch to the chest. They weren't simply irresponsible, they were drowning. My parents were in far deeper trouble than they'd admitted. I looked up from the papers, my voice rough. "How long have you two been in debt?" My father flinched. My mother's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. The numbers told the story for them. "You're thousands behind on loan payments," I said, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. "Every credit card is maxed, you're late on utilities, and—" My stomach dropped as I lifted the next page. "You're behind on rent." My father sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. My mother let out a sharp, defensive breath. "The landlord has been unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" I repeated. "He issued a formal eviction notice. He gave you 30 days?" My father's voice came out small. "We were going to figure it out." "You can't figure it out when you have no money," I snapped. "You spent every dollar you took from me. Every single one." My mother stood quickly, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Don't talk to us like we're children. We did what we had to do. Life has been unfair to us." "Life is unfair to everyone," I said, cutting her off. "But most people don't commit fraud and spend someone else's life savings." Her eyes flashed with hurt, wrapped in indignation. "You've always judged us. Always thought you were better because you had your little career. You weren't here, Corinne. You don't know how hard things have been." "I wasn't here because I was working," I said, "to pay for the home you stole." "We raised you," she snapped. "We gave you everything. Is this how you repay us? By throwing our mistakes back in our faces? Families support each other." Ah, there it was. The guilt. The emotional manipulation I'd grown up with, refined into a single poisonous line. "Family duty," she continued, voice quivering with wounded pride. "You think you can just walk away from us when we're suffering?" I took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "You didn't call me because you missed me. You called me because you were hiding something." My parents exchanged a look, tight, fearful, defeated. "Tell me the real reason," I said softly. "All of it." My father exhaled shakily. "We've been behind on everything. The credit cards, the loans, the car payments, and now rent. We thought we'd catch up, but the debt kept growing. We didn't plan for it to get this bad. We thought the money from the apartment would give us a fresh start," my mother added quietly. "But then expenses came up. Medical bills, car repairs, people needed help, and then it just slipped away faster than we expected." Slipped away. As though $380,000 were a handful of sand instead of a fortune. "So now what?" I asked. "You thought you could take my home, burn through the money, and I'd just—" "What? Move back in here and fix everything for you?" My mother's chin wobbled. We thought you'd understand. We thought you'd want to help. I have helped, I said, voice breaking despite myself. I helped every time you borrowed money when I was in my 20s, every time I covered bills in my 30s, every time I canceled plans to drive you to appointments, every time I pushed aside my own struggles to keep you afloat. But you took everything from me. My father whispered, We didn't mean for it to go this far. But it did, I said, and now you're out of money, out of time, and out of excuses. Silence settled over the room again. Heavy, suffocating, unavoidable. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We're going to be evicted. My father nodded, eyes wet. We have nowhere to go, Corinne. I closed my eyes, feeling tears prick at the edges. I was furious, heartbroken, betrayed, and yet some small part of me still wanted to help them, even though they'd destroyed so much. That conflict twisted painfully inside me. My mother took a step closer. Corinne, sweetheart, we need you, just for a little while, just until we get back on our feet. My father swallowed hard. Can you help us pay the rent? They begged Corinne for help with an urgent crisis. The people who stole my home now wanted me to save theirs. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at my parents as their plea hung in the air like thick smoke. Part of me, the part conditioned by decades of guilt, obligation, and emotional manipulation, wanted to crumble. Wanted to say yes, simply because they were my parents. Because that was the script I'd been handed since childhood. Corinne, the responsible one. Corinne, the fixer. Corinne, the one who makes everything better. But something in me had snapped the moment I learned they'd sold my home. No, I said quietly but firmly. I'm not paying your rent. My mother froze, eyes widening with disbelief before twisting into something far sharper. Excuse me? She hissed. After everything we've done for you? You won't help your own parents? You didn't ask for help, I said. You stole from me. Her expression darkened. We did what we had to do. Families support each other. Support, I repeated. You call forging my signature and selling my home support? You weren't using it, she exploded. You were off on your little adventure while we were here dealing with real problems. My father stepped forward, voice thick with wounded pride. You abandoned us, Corinne. You chose your career over your own family. We had no choice. My anger simmered, but for the first time in years, I didn't shrink under their accusations. I didn't fold. I didn't absorb the blame they hurled like stones. I didn't abandon you, I said. I lived my life, I followed my work, I trusted you, and you took advantage of that trust. My mother scoffed. Always the martyr. No, I said, not anymore. A startled silence followed. I had never spoken to them this directly, this decisively, and I could see it unsettled them. I'm not giving you money, I continued. Not for rent, not for debts, not for anything. My mother's face twisted with fury. Then what do you expect us to do? Live on the street? Be embarrassed in front of everyone we know? I expect you to face the consequences of your choices, I said softly. Her mouth fell open in outraged disbelief, but I didn't stay to hear the rest. I picked up the stack of bank statements, my hands shaking not from fear, but from a new, unfamiliar strength. Without another word, I walked out of their house, leaving behind the echo of their anger and desperation. When I reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. The emotional weight of the moment crushed against my ribs. These were my parents, my only family. Reporting them felt like cutting off my own limbs. But what they did wasn't a mistake. It was a crime, a deliberate, calculated violation. I needed help, real help, legal help. I dialed the number of a local attorney I had found during my frantic search that morning. His name was Marcus Lang, a property and fraud specialist. He answered on the second ring. Ms. Rowan, you said this was urgent? Yes, I said, my voice trembling. I need to talk, immediately. He agreed to meet within the hour. When I entered his office, I felt raw, emotionally stripped. Marcus listened quietly as I laid out the entire nightmare from start to finish. The forgery, the sale, the missing funds, the confession. By the time I was done, he leaned back in his chair, hands steepled. This is extremely serious, he said. What your parents did constitutes multiple felonies. forgery, identity theft, real estate fraud, misappropriation of funds. The list goes on. Hearing it laid out in legal terms made my stomach twist. "They're my parents," I murmured. "I don't want them to go to prison." "I understand," he said gently, "but this is bigger than family conflict. They forged legal documents to steal your property. If you don't file charges, you have no chance of reversing the sale or reclaiming the lost funds, and without action, you're legally considered complicit." The room tilted slightly. Complicit? Yes. If you allow the fraud to stand, the state may consider you aware and accepting of the transaction, especially once the financial institutions begin their own inquiries. My breath caught. Not only had my parents destroyed my stability, they could drag me down with them. "You need to file today," Marcus continued. "The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to unwind the sale, and you deserve protection." I stared at the stack of documents he placed in front of me, paperwork to initiate the legal process, papers that meant turning my parents in, papers that meant acknowledging, in ink and signature, that what they had done was unforgivable. Tears burned behind my eyes. "I don't know if I can do this." "You can," he said softly, "because you're not doing it out of spite. You're doing it to reclaim your life." I closed my eyes, inhaled shakily, and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not vengeance, but clarity. If I didn't protect myself, no one would. With trembling hands, I picked up the pen, and I signed the first document to begin the case. Corinne decides to take legal action. The moment the investigation started, secrets poured out like flood water. I didn't sleep the night after signing the documents. My mind replayed every moment with my parents, every argument, every childhood memory, every hint that maybe this outcome had been brewing for years. By morning, I felt hollow and bruised inside, but steady. It was too late to turn back. The investigation had already begun. Detectives arrived at my door within 48 hours, carrying clipboards, portable scanners, and the kind of firm sympathy reserved for people whose tragedies were still unfolding. They asked for the documents I had collected. I handed over the forged signature pages first, my stomach tightening as they examined them. One of the investigators, a woman named Detective Hart, placed the pages side by side with a sample of my real signature I'd provided. She didn't need long. "These aren't just forged," she said. "They're sloppy. Whoever did this didn't know how to mask pressure patterns or stroke direction." I thought of my mother sitting on the couch with her crossed legs and tight jawline, signing my name as though it were a routine chore. The investigators continued through the rest of the paperwork, title transfer forms, identification copies, notarized statements. Every time they marked another document with a yellow evidence tab, I felt something inside me tear a little more. There were multiple forged documents, not one, not two, multiple. The detectives moved on to the financial trail next. They pulled bank statements from my parents' accounts, tracing cash withdrawals and transfers with the careful precision of surgeons. Within hours, inconsistencies emerged. Withdrawals made minutes apart, money transferred to accounts belonging to people I had never heard of, checks cashed under suspicious circumstances. But the most damning piece came from the bank's surveillance footage. The investigators called me into the station to view it. My breath caught as the video flickered to life on the screen. There was my mother, wearing sunglasses and a scarf pulled awkwardly around her neck, walking up to the teller window. She slid over documents that claimed she was me. Moments later, she accepted a thick envelope of cash and hurried out of frame. Seeing it didn't break me. It gutted me. I pressed a hand against my mouth, holding back a noise I didn't know was forming. Detective Hart placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry you have to see this," she said softly. "It's okay," I whispered. "I need to." The investigation stretched into days, then a week. Each day brought new revelations, some shocking, some expected, all painful. Investigators interviewed people in my parents' social circle, uncovering a surprising pattern of gossip. Their friends had been bragging about new money, about upgrades, about generosity that seemed suspiciously reckless. One woman admitted my parents had told her they were finally getting what they deserved after years of hard work. Another confessed she'd been loaned several $1,000s by them, but had no idea where the funds came from. Yet another revealed that my mother had hinted at a family member helping them out big time, though she never said who. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. They hadn't been desperate at first. They'd been thrilled, empowered, elevated. Their desperation came later, when the tide of money dried up. The detectives then uncovered something even more serious: fraudulent identity claims. Copies of my identification had been altered, subtly enough to fool the hurried notary, but blatantly enough to be criminal. Someone had used my information to access financial channels I never authorized. Despite everything, I struggled. I cried after every meeting. I felt guilty and furious and heartbroken all at once. But each time I wavered, each time a small, aching part of me wanted to protect my parents, I reminded myself, they had not protected me, not when it mattered. When the police finally visited my parents, the shift was immediate. My father called me 6 times in a row. My mother sent frantic messages, some pleading, some accusing. According to the detectives, they panicked the moment officers approached them. They denied everything at first, then contradicted themselves, then lashed out. Their landlord appeared at the police station the following day, furious and eager to provide documentation. Months of unpaid rent, repeated broken promises, a written confession, signed by my father, that he couldn't keep up with payments and was working on family help. That part twisted like a knife. On the 5th day of the investigation, another bombshell dropped. Detectives traced several unexplained withdrawals to a casino. Not just one visit, multiple. My father had been gambling heavily, far more than he'd ever admitted. Thousands had disappeared in single nights, tens of thousands over weeks. He hadn't just spent my money, he'd fed it into a machine of addiction. And then came the last blow. Near the end of the second week, Detective Hart called me into her office with a tone I hadn't heard before, something weighty, something decisive. "We found something else," she said, "something that could escalate this to felony-level prosecution." She placed a folder in front of me. Inside, it was evidence so severe it made my breath stop. Evidence emerges that could put her parents in prison. My parents tried to turn the entire family against me to avoid prison. The moment the investigation became real, when detectives began visiting their home and calling their acquaintances, my parents launched a full-scale campaign to rewrite the story. They reached out to every relative, every cousin, every old friend, and distant connection. They painted themselves as victims, spinning tales of betrayal and abandonment, so dramatic I wouldn't have believed them if I hadn't seen the messages myself. In one version, I had given them permission to handle the sale, then changed my mind. In another, I had lost control overseas and was now punishing them to deflect from my own irresponsibility. And the ugliest version, the one my mother seemed to repeat most, was that I was a cold, ungrateful daughter who cared more about money than her own parents. The first call came from my aunt, her voice sharp with accusation. "How could you do this to your mother and father?" she demanded. "They're old, Corinne. They're struggling. And you're dragging them into court?" I inhaled slowly, trying to maintain composure. "Did they tell you they forged my signature and sold my apartment?" A stunned silence, then sputtering denial. "That can't be true. They would never—" "They did," I said. "I have the documents. I have video. I have bank records." But she didn't want to listen. She hung up, muttering something about family loyalty. And she wasn't the only one. Text messages poured in. Some were angry, some were passive-aggressive, some were dripping with disappointment. For a moment, their strategy worked. I felt cornered, judged, unseen, but I refused to be buried under lies. I gathered every piece of evidence the investigators had given me, copies of forged documents, screenshots of transactions, still frames from the bank surveillance footage showing my mother withdrawing cash. Then I sent a long, detailed message to the entire family group chat, everyone they had poisoned against me. I wrote, "These are not accusations, these are facts. My parents committed fraud. They stole my property, forged my identity, emptied the sale funds, and left me homeless while they burned through $380,000 in months. I love them, but I will not be responsible for the crimes they committed." Then, one by one, I attached the evidence. For a while, no one replied. Then, the typing bubbles began. My cousin Nora was the first to change her tone. "Oh my God, Corinne, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Then my uncle. This is serious. They lied to us. Another relative apologized for calling me harsh. Another admitted my parents had seemed evasive when questioned. Another said they'd suspected something was off but didn't want to get involved. As the truth spread, the tide shifted. Support trickled in, then grew. People reached out privately, telling me I'd done the right thing. Not that it made the situation any easier. My parents, meanwhile, began losing allies. Fast. Their calls grew more frantic. Their messages filled with increasing desperation. The same relatives who had initially judged me now demanded answers from them. My parents' responses were defensive, then angry, then incoherent. They were unraveling. 2 days later, they showed up at my temporary rental. My mother looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were swollen, her voice hoarse. "Corinne," she whispered, gripping my forearm as soon as I opened the door. "Please, please drop the charges." My father hovered behind her, wringing his hands, trying to look both pitiful and dignified. "I can't," I said softly. "You can," my mother cried. "You're choosing not to. They're talking about prison, Corinne. Prison, for us." "You chose this," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to stay strong. "Not me." "We made mistakes," my father said, stepping forward. "We were overwhelmed. We didn't think things through." "But prison? You would really put us there?" "I'm not putting you anywhere," I said. "The law is. The choices you made are." My mother's face crumpled. She dropped to her knees, literally sobbing. "I'm your mother. I carried you. I raised you. I fed you. I changed your diapers. How can you do this to me?" The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. It always did. That was her power, her instinctive ability to reach into the softest parts of me and twist. My father's voice softened. "Corinne, honey, think about how this will look. Think about how this will affect the family. Think about how you'll feel when we're gone." Emotional manipulation from both sides, polished by decades of practice. I closed my eyes, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I didn't want this," I whispered, "but I can't undo what you did." "You can," my father insisted. "Just drop the charges." I opened my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see my parents. I saw two people who had hurt me more deeply than anyone ever had. Two people who felt entitled to my life, my future, my stability. "No," I said, "I won't." They stared at me, shocked, betrayed, horrified, as I gently stepped back and closed the door. Inside, my chest heaved with sobs, but beneath the grief, beneath the ache, was something steady. Resolve, self-protection, a decision forming like iron in my spine. I wiped my face, sat at the table, and reached for my phone, because now I knew exactly what I had to do next. Corinne decides on her final move, one that will change everything. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like freedom. When the dust finally settled, weeks after the investigation concluded, after the interviews, the paperwork, the evidence logs, the emotional hurricanes, I found myself sitting alone in the detective's office, listening to the final outcome. It felt surreal, like the ending of a story I didn't remember starting. The prosecutors had more than enough evidence to pursue severe charges. Forgery alone carried years of potential prison time. The fraudulent identity claims, the illegal sale, the financial misappropriation, any of them could have put my parents behind bars for a very long time, but I made a choice. I requested leniency, not absolution, not forgiveness, but leniency. I did not want them to go to prison for the rest of their lives. I wanted accountability, not destruction. I wanted boundaries, not blood. I wanted to reclaim my life without carrying the weight of pushing my aging parents into a cell they would never leave. So, with my full cooperation, the prosecutors offered a deal: restitution, mandatory financial oversight, community service, a criminal record that would follow them, court-ordered counseling, and strict probation, but no prison. The detectives were surprised. Some even gently questioned me, but I stood firm. They would face consequences, yes, but I wouldn't allow them to be ruined. I walked out of the courthouse feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the case was finally closed, heavier because the emotional aftermath was only beginning. The first thing I did was secure my remaining assets. With my lawyer's guidance, I set up protections I should have established years ago: trusts, alerts, banking safeguards, notarization requirements, power of attorney revocations. I learned how vulnerable I had been, how easily trust without boundaries could transform into danger. Then I looked for a new place to live. It took weeks of searching, budgeting, and soul searching, but eventually I found a modest condominium with a small balcony that caught the morning light. It wasn't my old apartment. It didn't carry the echo of familiar footsteps or the scent of old books, but it was mine, truly mine, untouched, uncontaminated by betrayal. Moving in felt like turning a page. Each box I unpacked was a reminder of my resilience. What survived, what I saved, what I still carried forward. But healing wasn't automatic. I kept expecting my phone to vibrate with another message from my parents, another guilt-filled plea, another emotional ambush. But the calls slowed, then stopped entirely. They had withdrawn, retreating into their silence, perhaps ashamed, perhaps angry, perhaps both. And I realized something important. Silence from them didn't mean I had to sit in isolation. So I began therapy. The first session was the hardest. My voice wobbled as I explained everything: my upbringing, my parents' patterns, the betrayal, the guilt that clung like a second skin. The therapist listened, nodding gently, helping me unravel knots I hadn't even known were there. Week by week, I learned how to separate love from enabling, how to understand that compassion didn't mean erasing consequences, how to define boundaries without defining myself by them. I realized I had spent most of my life trying to earn my parents' approval, carrying their emotional burdens like weights strapped to my ribs. But somewhere in all of this devastation, I gained clarity. I could love them. I could care about their well-being. But I no longer had to sacrifice myself to save them. With that realization came something I hadn't felt in months: peace. I started rebuilding not just a home, but a life. I returned to my work, focusing on projects that reminded me of my own strength and independence. I cooked in my new kitchen, walked through my new neighborhood, sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise. Small things, quiet things, healing things. One afternoon, as I organized my new bookshelf, I found the old spare key, the one I had given my parents. I held it in my palm for a long moment, feeling everything it symbolized. Then finally, I dropped it into a drawer, not out of anger, but acceptance. They no longer had access to my home. They no longer had access to my boundaries. They no longer had access to my life in the same way. But the question remained: would I let them back in at all? Weeks later, they reached out, this time with a single, hesitant message. No accusations, no manipulation, just, "We'd like to talk if you're willing." I read it 3 times, feeling the familiar tug between duty and self-preservation. Then I took a slow, steady breath. Because after everything, after the lies, the theft, the unraveling, I finally had the power to choose. And I knew exactly what decision I was going to make next. Corinne rebuilds her life and makes a final decision about her parents. After everything I lost and everything I uncovered, I finally learned that protecting my peace sometimes means walking away from the people who break it. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, not to erase the past, but to reclaim the future they tried to take from me. And in the end, justice didn't come from punishment. It came from choosing myself. Today, my home, my boundaries, and my strength belong only to me. But I still wonder, what would you do if the deepest betrayal came from the people who raised you? Stories like mine remind us how fragile trust can be, and how powerful it feels when we finally take our lives back. If this journey made you feel something, stay with me. There are more truths, more battles, and more victories worth hearing. Your support helps these stories reach those who need them most. And tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it?